Hello and welcome to the webinar on Targeted Sheep Grazing in Organic Dryland Systems by Fabian Menalled, Perry Miller, and Devon Ragen. This is your host, Alice Formiga from the eOrganic Community of Practice at extension.org. Today's presentation will last about 45 minutes, followed by about 30 minutes for questions. I'm very pleased to welcome today's presenters. We have Fabian Menalled, Perry Miller, and Devon Ragen of Montana State University in Bozeman, Montana. They're going to be presenting the results of their research in which they were exploring ways to replace tillage with targeted grazing to manage weeds and terminate cover crops. So with that, I'm going to pass along the microphone and the screen control to our first presenter, Fabian Menalled. So Fabian, you can unmute your mic there and click on the screen now, and you should have control of the slides.
So thank you, Alice. It is exactly noon here in Montana. So good morning or good afternoon, depending if you are either west or east from us. So today we'll be talking about a research project we've been conducting for the last, I think, 4 or 5 years. And our idea is to see if we can integrate some target grazing in our organic systems to control both weeds and terminate the cover crops. But the overall theme is to reduce tillage intensity. Now, I don't think I need to explain much about the importance of cover crops to this audience because probably you're very well aware of the many benefits that cover crops have on a system, either in organic or conventional systems. Cover crops enhance the nutrient cycling, favor water infiltration, can help to control erosion. If they have flowering species such as the figure that I have here, they could be providing pollen and nectar for pollinators or either for biocontrol agents. And they can also help us for weed management. However, there are also some potential negative aspects of cover crops. If you are in a system like the one we have here, a semi-dry environment, we'll receive anywhere between 9, 10 inches of precipitation to around 12 to 14 inches of precipitation. Retaining soil moisture is a must for us. There are also some costs associated with the cover crop in the forms of establishment, maintenance, and termination. And farmers do not get a direct source of revenues. So they are investing money and they don't get anything back from that cover crop, at least in the form of money in the short term. And there are also some termination challenges. Most of our cover crops here in Montana are terminated with mechanical cultivation, and the problem that we have, as I said, we receive anywhere between 9 to 12, 13 inches of precipitation, that if you do it in a period when we don't have any rain for the last 3 to 5 weeks, and then the wind blows, what you end having is this situation we're basically losing our most precious resource, which is soil. There's some interest in using alternative practices to terminate these cover crops, such as this idea of roller crimping, but it doesn't work in our environments. Perry Miller, who will be talking later, has tried here, and he could not get a really good termination of the cover crops. Other farmers, what they will be doing is they mow the cover crops, and then they will be incorporating that cover crop with a spader. So that represents basically 2 different pieces of machines that have to be driven into the fields with the associated cost and time. So we said, well, can we just use those cover crops as a source of forage for, in our specific case, sheep? Can we terminate the cover crops through some strategic grazing? So that was a simple question we asked, and we tested a few years ago, 5 years ago more or less, where we grabbed these cover crops, we brought our sheep, we let them graze, and around 5 to 6 days later, this is what we saw. So clearly, yes, they can terminate the cover crop. But whenever I see this type of sort of dramatic change occurring in a few days from having a lot of vegetation to nothing, I think we need to ask ourselves, what are the implications of this strategic grazing. And the implication goes not just in terms of the crop yield, but it could go into the weed pressures you may be having, as well as the economic of that alternative practice. So we ask that questions at basically two levels. One is at the vegetable farm levels. That's what I will be talking. Then Perry will be talking about our experiments in small grain systems. And finally, Devon will be talking about the livestock aspects of our research. So let's start with the vegetable farm component of our study. Basically, we conducted our study at the Town Harvest Garden, which is a student-run farm here at Montana State University. It is certified, an organic certified establishment, and the produce are sold through CSA as well as farmers market. The management production that the farmer has there is basically he divides the farm in 6 sections, and 1 section will be receiving a cover crop, and the other 5 sections are used for production. And then what he does is he rotates the cover crop across the farm. So each section will receive a cover crop every 6 years. And the cover crops he uses is basically a cocktail of buckwheat, beet, sweet clover, and peas. And what we said is, well, let's try it if we can bring our sheep there and graze these cover crops. So we designed a pretty simple experiment. Basically, we divided this cover crop area in 6, and 3 areas were at randomly grazed or mowed. But we wanted to take a lot of measurements in terms of what happened with the environment. So we took measurements of the soil nutrient content, as well as the compaction of the soil. We took measurements of the soil temperatures with these little eye buttons that you can see here that will be measuring the temperatures across the summer. And also we took measurements of the moisture in each one of these different plots with these TDR probes. We took estimates of the biomass that was produced in these cover crops, as well as the presence of weeds before and after we terminate the cover crops. Now, because this is a production system, we are concerned about what will be the impact of these management practices, the mow or graze, in the subsequent crop. So the following year, what we did is we planted a series of crops, kohlrabi, lettuce, and spinach, all across this area. And we conducted this study over 2 years. The next year, we came back and we measured the weed pressure as well as the yield in the previously grazed and previously mowed areas. So early in the season, around June, we brought our temporary fences. This is some equipment you may need to consider if you're going to be using this idea of strategic grazing. These fences should be hooked to a solar panel, so they will be hot fences. And also, as you can see here, you need to bring some water for the sheep. So those are costs and some basic infrastructure that you need to consider. We brought our sheep and we let them graze, and we noticed that 1 hour after we started our study, definitely there were some differences. You can see in the right area of the screen the places that we mow. In the graze, you know, it will take a few days for the sheep to consume all that biomass. Now, when we look at the environmental parameters, we didn't see any difference in terms of the soil temperature or soil moisture, as well as the soil compaction. So both years, the environmental impact of the sheep grazing and mowing was exactly the same. Now, when we look at what happened with our weeds, you can see here what was going on. Basically, the sheep went and grazed everything but the red root pigweed, because at this stage, when they're producing seeds, it's basically unpalatable to them. Now, very interestingly, when we mowed, we also have a resprouting of the red root pigweed. So the after mowing or grazing wheat communities were very similar. In one case, they were dominated by red root pigweed because they either resprout in the mowing or they were not grazed because unpalatability in the graze systems. And a very similar situation, happened with our second most important wheat species, which was common mallow, Malva neglecta, that has a prostate growing, so we cannot touch it when we were mowing, but also sheep don't like it because it's unpalatable. So I found it very interesting that we end having similar wheat communities by totally different mechanisms. One is a mechanical mowing and the other one is a biological grazing, but still would not impact the wheat communities. We did a very quick back of the envelope assessment of how much money could this represent for the farmer. So assuming that the farmer does not have sheep and he basically sells a grazing lease, based on the quality of the forage we were having, she could be making anywhere between $10 to $18 per acre by just selling the grazing lease. Now, another very important question is what will happen in the subsequent year in terms of both wheat pressure as well as crop yields. And in here I'm showing in red the previously grazed areas and in gray the previously mowed areas. And you can see that for kohlrabi, lettuce or spinach, the wheat pressure was the same in the previously grazed or previously mowed areas. Again, similar results happen both years. When we look at the yields, and here I'm looking at the yields in 2013 and 2014, for kohlrabi and lettuce in 2013, we lost the spinach because it was a very cold spring, but in 2014 we have the 3 crops, and you can see that again, there were no impact in either grazing or mowing the previous year in terms of the, again, wheat community or wheat pressures and yields. So I guess this is telling us that in summary, it is possible to integrate a target sheep grazing for terminating the cover crops and control the weeds in a vegetable farm. We are not seeing any impact in terms of the environment of the farm, the biology of the farm, as well as the yield of the farm. Now, because these represent the small acres that we have here in Montana, we wanted to test these ideas in small grain systems that basically dominate the northern Great Plains regions. And this is what Perry will be talking next. So I'll pass the microphone to Perry.
Can you hear me? Well, I guess you can't answer me, so I'm going to assume you can. Perry Miller here. I'm going to talk a little bit about small grain systems and some research that we've done in that regard. Just again, a reminder that tillage is a crucial challenge in organic agriculture, and this can be almost a real personal defeating kind of a situation when you do get some. I could show pictures of blowing dust and soil in the ditches, but I've talked to long-term guys who, when they have a big erosion event, it's enough to actually make you question your involvement in organic agriculture. So it's a pretty significant challenge, and one that we wanted to look at. And we thought, as our team got together, we thought grazing might be a real part of that solution to try and limit the amount of tillage that we had to use in small grain systems. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a study that we've got going near Bozeman. This is actually I-90. So if you're driving east of Bozeman and look north, you can actually see this the study just off the interstate. You can see a number of plots going there. This is our rotation that we're using. So we start with safflower underseeded to clover, which is our cover crop in this particular study. Sweet clover is an obligate biennial, and I'm going to focus most in this talk on the sweet clover to winter wheat phase. Then we follow that with lentils. Lentils, as I'll show you just a little bit of data on that, are a really important cash crop in Montana farming systems, especially organic systems, and then back to winter wheat. This whole we're still awaiting a little bit of data on the weeds to really start to understand whether that system is evolving differently with the different management systems I'll show you here in a minute. But I wanted to point out that we have deep-rooted crops here for a reason. Safflower very deep, sweet clover very deep, winter wheat relatively deep, lentil shallow, winter wheat also very deep. We're trying to combat one specific weed, which is creeping thistle or Canada thistle at this site. And so far, we've held it at bay with that rotation. So we've got 3 systems: organic tilled, replicated in blocks throughout the study. Here's where the grazed plots would lie in the green, and then we also have what we'll call a chemical no-till system. This is probably not a rotation that you would ever see in a conventional sense in Montana, but we wanted to have some standard to compare organic production to, where we're allowed to use pesticides and fertilizer, just to see where we're getting with these organic systems. And so the question we were asking, and this is really a question I have to credit Pat Carr with, is it possible to completely avoid tillage in organic systems in the semi-arid northern plains? I mean, quite a challenge. That was our plan when we started out this study, to see if we could attempt complete no-till via grazing. Pretty quickly, I think Devon's going to summarize some of the things we learned. We learned pretty quickly that there was going to be some weed management challenges that would get us in a barrier if we really went for the full 5 years of no tillage. And so we'll talk about that here in a minute. But I want to show you some results from another site that was run at NDSU Dickinson by Pat Carr. It was part of the same study where Pat had ran 3 different organic systems and was very determined to try and see where he would end up if he went with obligate or elimination of tillage in the system. And he used a combination of crimp rolling and grazing. They get a little more biomass in that wetter environment at Dickinson, and so some of these crimp rolling options become a little more possible. We've played with this technique in our drier environment at Bozeman. I guess the bottom line on that would be is by the time we get an effective crimp on the crop to actually stop it growing, it's usually used all the water and made all the seed that it's going to make, and so we're having some difficulty getting that to work in our environment. But here's Pat's. So he also had a 5-year rotation. We had some different crops in there, different cover crops, some warm season crops like millet and bean. What I'm going to do though here is just focus quickly on his winter wheat story, because that's one crop that was in common between the 2 sites. And here's his yield results. And so, the first year, second year of the study, certainly some yield drag. This green bar is the obligate organic no-till. The blue bar is the conventional or clean till, as Pat called it, and then they had some reduced till strategy that was in the orange. And so in the first couple of years, yeah, there was a yield drag in that winter wheat where they went with obligate no-till, but by years 3 and 4 of the study, you can see it was an economic disaster. And so that's one of the things we were trying to avoid getting into in our Fort Ellis study. And so back to Fort Ellis, again, remind you that there's 3 cropping systems going. This picture was taken this June. The darker green plots happen to be winter wheat. These lush green ones are the sweet clover cover crop. And so we got good growth, good establishment of that. And then these lighter plots where you can see stubble or soil areas, that would be the new lentil or safflower seedings coming along. And remind you that we've got those same 3 systems. And so one of the things that we've evolved to with our graze system is we can go 36 months, a continuous 36 months out of the 5 years without tillage. And so we're pretty happy with that as a pretty significant step towards no-till, but it would be a challenge for us to get further than that. I want to show you just a little bit about our lentil results. 2015 was the first year of certification at the Fort Ellis site, and so I'm going to start with the certified crops, certified organic crops. I just, as I was thinking about this morning, I realized I forgot to put a picture of lentils. You know, I'm so used to talking to Montana producers where they would know what lentils look like. There's probably a lot of people on this webinar who don't know what lentils look like. They're a very short crop. They're about a foot tall, so you can imagine the harvesting challenges that come along with lentil, and you might also imagine some of the weed competition challenges with such a short growing crop. And so here's our three systems, the organic tilled on the left. Here's our chemical no-till. So remember, that's our standard, and we were able to hit equivalent yields between the organic tilled and chem no-till systems. But our organic graze system actually took a significant yield hit of about 600-pound yield loss. And that was due, at least in part, to volunteer winter wheat that we were learning how to get a better control of. Not only is the volunteer winter wheat a strong competitor, it's also something that's difficult to clean out of the lentil seed itself, so you end up with higher dockage factors. Here's our 2016 results, and again, very similar that the organic till and chem no-till systems. Better yields overall in 2016, despite being a drier year. We did a much better job with the winter wheat, volunteer winter wheat control in the organic graze system, but we still paid a weed-related penalty of something in the order of a 500-pound yield loss. And so I've already made this point, pleased that we're able to hit that chem no-till standard with the organic tilled. We were losing about $200 an acre, though, with this organic graze system just in this lentil phase, and this is a really key profit center. Lentils are worth a lot of money, especially in organic systems, and in this particular phase, there's no grazing opportunity to try and recapture some of that lost value, so that remains a challenge for the moment. I want to show you some winter wheat results. So again, 2015, first year of organic certification. And you'll see, again, a pretty strong yield depression for the organic graze system, and so you might think, wow, that's not a very good number. I was actually a little bit excited to see that number, and I'll show you why here in a moment. We had, so the previous late summer, we had a very rare for us 2.5-inch single rainfall event, and unfortunately our sheep were on the plots, on the sweet clover plots when that rain came, and so we ended up with some severely, in that mud situation, we ended up with some severe soil compaction that, despite using an organic, or a no-till seeder that's good at penetrating the soil, we were not able to get good penetration and good seed-to-soil contact. And so we didn't have a great establishment that winter wheat, which allowed the weeds to play too much. And so we decided to graze those weeds off. And so this yield, this 47 bushels an acre, is yield from regrowth. And here's what that picture looked like. Here was late April. The weeds were really starting to overrun the winter wheat, and so we did not want to let them go to seed. Put the sheep in there to start grazing off all that biomass. And here's what it looked like 5 days later. And so you can still see the rows of the winter wheat. And I wished, for some reason, I don't have a photo to show you of the final wheat here, but we got a 47 bushel to the acre crop out of this, so I was pretty pleased with that. In 2016, we had much more normal seeding conditions, I guess actually in the previous fall in 2015. We still had a yield drag for the organic grazed, but again, it's a surprisingly strong number. The 80s to 90 bushel range for the other systems. This was 72 in the organic graze, and this is what the plots look like on May 23rd of this year. So you can imagine, as a research team, we're having some conversations about what to do with this particular phase of the study, because it looks sufficiently weedy that maybe we should be grazing it off. But dandelion's an early season weed. We reasoned that it would probably drop out of the system pretty quickly. There actually was a lot of winter wheat there, despite how yellow that field looked like. And that's what the crop looked like by the end of June without grazing. So we opted not to graze it. And you saw the yield that I already posted you. And it's also important to keep in mind, relative to this sweet clover cover crop, or sweet clover forage, in that chemical system, it costs us money to spray that out and with repeat sprays to keep it weed-free during the rest of that season. We're still awaiting on final economic numbers for the study, which we will have, but I'm going to estimate $40 an acre conservatively. And same with the tillage, with the organic tillage. We're going to estimate, if you're really looking at depreciation and fuel costs associated with the tillage, and the repeat tillage is required to keep that cover crop progressing as we wanted it to, another $40 an acre. But in the forage value from the sweet clover, in 2016, we removed 3.3 tons to the acre of clover as high-value forage. If we valued it at $30 per animal unit month, that's somewhere in the order of a $200 an acre gross revenue. And of course, you still have all the things Fabian talked about. You need fencing, you need water, but that's going to vary from farm to farm. But the point is that there's some returns actually during that grazed session or grazed system that are really quite valuable. Here's what the tillage termination of sweet clover looks like. We go in at very first bloom of sweet clover. Here was grazing. Unfortunately, it was a rainy day when I took that picture, but they've been grazing, I think, for 4 or 5 days at this point. Here's a couple weeks later. You can see we've got still lots of residue left, and Devon will show you some of the things we learned about grazing sweet clover over the course of this study. Here's a month later, and again, still good cover. Really like to see that from a soil management point of view. And here is just last week. And so you see the winter wheat coming up through those grazed off sweet clover stubble, and still quite a bit of residue left in place to protect that soil and build soil. So that's what we really like to see. And we're really, soil value, measuring soil changes, that's something that is long-term, 10-year kind of time frame. We really haven't been able to focus on that in the study, but you get a sense from what that, or just look at what the organic tilled sweet clover looks like. This is a photo from a couple weeks ago. So that soil's in a fairly vulnerable state. Here's the grazed sweet clover. I'm going to say that's sufficiently armored that that's actually that's going to be a pretty resilient stage for that soil to be in. Here's what the chemical system looks like. So it's not quite to that level, but still reasonably impressive. So questions, some overriding questions from the small grain systems. Really, how to value that grazing in the rotational systems has been a challenge, and it's one that our economist involved in this study continues to wrestle with, because there are just so many ways that you can interact with the grazing, and they've all got different economic implications. And the other one is probably when to make that decision, that flex decision to graze for weed control. You're really trying to predict the future about how a crop might be compromised by a current situation. That's not always easy to know how that's going to turn out. Just for a quick, this is a slide from Fabian, but just a quick summary relative to the weed community results. We would say generally the grazed organic has had higher weed abundance, which is not surprising, but it's to this point it's been manageable. And of note, we have avoided this real game-changing weed, Canada thistle, which can be a real deal breaker in our Montana system. And the weed diversity has been impacted, based on our early data. Cheat grasses dominating no-till winter wheat, as we would expect. We're seeing a shift in weed community composition between organic tilled and organic grazed systems. But this story remains to be told. We've got more data coming in, and we would actually like to track this over a little longer time frame. And with that, I'm going to throw this to Devon.
Hi everyone, this is Devon Ragen. I'm going to discuss the sheep management side of our sheep grazing for cover crops. The main goal for this research was to investigate the use of sheep as cover crop terminators compared to the more conventional termination methods like tillage and herbicides, and see if by using sheep, if we can benefit both the farmer and the livestock producer. Our objectives were to compare the use of sheep versus conventional methods, but also compare the effects of two different grazing treatments, either low stocking density continuous grazing or high stocking density rotational grazing. We used the plots at Fort Ellis that Dr. Miller described, which are 1/3 acre plots, and we split them in half and had each grazing treatment on each side. So starting in 2014, the cover crop that we grazed was yellow sweet clover, which is a biennial, and we grazed it during its second year of growth. Production varied by plot, but was about 5,000 to 9,000 pounds per acre, And this is a very vigorous stand of sweet clover, and we had some plants that were almost 7 feet tall. So when we put the sheep in these plots, they almost disappeared and were actually fairly well hidden when they first started grazing. I really like this aerial view as it shows one of the grazing plots cut in half with the continuous grazing side on the right and the rotational sections on the left. We used yearling Rambouillet wethers and put 18 sheep per acre on the continuous side and 72 sheep per acre on the rotational side, and the sheep rotated through the sweet clover sections every 5 days. In the picture at the bottom right, the sheep on the continuous side are halfway through the grazing period, so 20 days. Next, going to the left, is rotation number 1 at 15 days of regrowth. Then rotation 2 at 10 days of regrowth. And you can actually see the sheep. There's 3 dots clustered around their black mineral tub on their 5th day of grazing in the 3rd rotational quarter. And the 4th, which is farthest to the left, has not been grazed yet, and the sheep will move there next. This sweet clover crop provided the sheep with a high-quality forage diet that averaged about 20% protein and was about 63% digestible. The first year we attempted the sweet clover grazing, we thought we would have to completely eliminate the crop to terminate it, and we were afraid that even though it is a biennial, that we may have problems with it regrowing the next year and causing issues in our winter wheat stand. So we expected the sheep to eat every bit of the sweet clover, and after 40 days at the initial stocking densities, the sheep were unable to completely remove the crop because they just could not keep up with that vigorous growth. And especially as the plants matured and the stalks became more fibrous, they were less palatable to the sheep, and they really had to chew on them to consume them. After the 40-day grazing session, those wethers that we were initially using were removed and needed for an additional research project, so we brought replacement ewes onto the plots to finish off the sweet clover. It took them between 8 to 20 days to completely remove the sweet clover, which we then, for that year, considered to be terminated. We had 48 sheep per acre on the continuous side and upped that rotational side to 193 sheep per acre to get the job done. The initial 40-day grazing session with the wethers resulted in weight gains, and they gained almost a ½ pound per day for both grazing treatments, so either the continuous or rotational side. We did not weigh the ewes that came on after the wethers, though, and they most likely lost weight just because the forage quality was fairly low by that time, as the wethers had removed all of that leafy material and left mainly the woody stalks. So in 2015, since there was no difference in continuous versus rotational grazing, for simplicity's sake, the sheep that we put on grazed a whole plot continuously at a rate of 48 sheep per acre, which works out to be about 16 sheep per plot. We again used yearling Rambouillet wethers and just had them graze the active growing parts of the plant, like the leaves and buds and flowers, which are also the highest quality parts, and they just left the stems. The picture on this slide is the first grazing session in June after they had trampled it down a bit, and we had them graze for 8 days. There were 5 grazing sessions total on June 8th, July 6th, August 3rd, August 23rd, September 25th, and other than that initial grazing session in June, the sheep usually graze these plots for only 2 to 3 days at a time. The last grazing session was mainly just for weed management at the end of September, and we used 30 white-faced lambs, and they were removed from the plots after 3 days of grazing right as the winter wheat was starting to emerge, so it had already been seeded. The grazing management this year was much different than that first year and required much more labor since we had to put the sheep on the plots and remove them multiple times, but it still terminated the crop successfully and left a lot more biomass to protect the soil. We did not weigh sheep prior to or after these grazing sessions because they were so short we wouldn't have been able to capture those changes in body weight. So here's a picture of one of the sweet clover plots after grazing. This was early in September, and there's about 1.2 tons of dry matter per acre of that standing sweet clover litter left behind. Through trial and error, I think we definitely accomplished terminating a cover crop with sheep, and I believe that producers can find a way to integrate sheep into their farming systems as well. Producers will have to adapt the number of sheep used to their fields in their operation based on how many sheep they have or how fast they want to terminate the crop or complete the grazing session. All right, well, just these top two photos show sheep grazing weeds after winter wheat harvest and lentil harvest. The bottom left, we had a failed safflower sweet clover crop that was overtaken by weeds. So instead of just mowing it, we put some of our mature rams on the plot to get some grazing value out of it. And that bottom right picture shows some of our sheep grazing growing winter wheat, and this is the wheat that regrew and was later harvested, as Dr. Miller talked about. All right, so in summary, sheep can be successfully integrated into farming systems to benefit both the crop and livestock producer. We were able to eliminate tillage for a continuous 36 months out of our 5-year rotation, which equates to a huge monetary savings. As Perry mentioned, though, it would be challenging for us to eliminate tillage for longer than that 3 years. In horticulture settings, grazing can be used to terminate cover crops and manage weeds while providing a very high-quality forage to the livestock. And you can get anywhere from $10 to $18 as an estimate per acre if you offer it as a grazing lease. We did learn a lot during this research about how to manage sweet clover as a cover crop and grazing forage, and definitely learned a lot about how to time our grazing sessions around weather events and farming operations like seeding. At the bottom of this slide, we have a link to a video about our project that we would like to encourage everyone to check out. And I think at this time we'd be more than happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I'm going to move on to some questions here. So everyone can unmute their microphones. How would grazing management change with the much larger scale of commercial fields? I'm not sure I grasp how this will work. Portable net fencing at that scale would be a challenge.
So with sheep, the cool thing about sheep compared to cattle, if we are talking about a huge commercial setting, really, really large fields, sheep can actually be herded and fences do not have to be used. So that is one plus. If you have a large enough area and a large enough group of sheep, they will flock together and they can actually be herded without fences. And of course, you'd still have to provide a water source, but that could be manageable with a water truck and a tank on the back.
Yeah, Perry here. I'm not a livestock expert by any means, but I do know of an organic grower in eastern Montana who uses cattle on his system. I think very economically to graze aftermath, graze weeds at certain times. Certainly, some of the density questions that we were able to do at small plot scale are probably going to change at a larger field scale. But there's examples here in the valley also, actually under conventional production, where just as Devon said, relative to using herders with sheep, where they do graze aftermath in behind some irrigated cropping systems very, very profitably. So again, we're presenting some ideas here. I would, as always, the farmer is usually the master of figuring out how to make it work in their context.
Here's someone who has low-line cattle, a herd of 60, which is a smaller breed of cattle, and was going to use them instead of sheep. Do you have any thoughts on how effective that would be?
No, we haven't done any of our research with cattle, but I've talked with a lot of producers that do use cattle for grazing cover crops, and depending on your crop, I think it would just be as successful as you make it with cows as well. As long as the cover crop is palatable to cattle, it should be successful grazing.
Yeah, Perry here again. I just wanted to reference this question to Darren Boss up in Montana State University's Northern Ag Research Center near Havre. They have been doing some, this is not organic, but they have been doing some cover crop grazing with cattle in that system and been doing it very successfully. Again, that's at larger plots than ours, but it's still plot scale. So There is also a statewide initiative going on with grazing cover crops that, again, Darren would be a good conduit for finding out more information on that.
Can you repeat his name again? Because I think it didn't come through that clearly on the mic there.
So it's Darren Boss,
Okay.
spelled just conventionally with B-O-S-S.
Okay.
And I could almost, you know what, I think I can give you his phone number by,
Okay.
I better not do that. Better not do that.
Okay. Yeah, but everything is searchable now. So, okay. Another question: are there any cover crop species that should not be grazed by sheep because of health reasons?
Well, the buckwheat that we've grazed buckwheat before, and buckwheat actually does have a phototoxin in it that makes sheep extremely photosensitive, and it mostly does affect more of the pink-skinned livestock. We grazed it. It's palatable and it is nutritious to sheep, but it does cause that photosensitivity, and it will make their skin turn pink. They sunburn very easily. We had a few that without shade, they actually did act a little neurologic. It affected them to that extent. And to combat that, if we were grazing a buckwheat cover crop, if we offered the sheep shade, we had no problems at all. Most of the time during the heat of the day when the sun is really bright and out, the sheep are going to take shelter and lay down in the shelter or the shade and ruminate anyways. And so that is the only cover crop I can think of off of the top of my head that we've had an issue with, and we still found ways to work around it. And providing shade for the sheep was as easy as when we brought them to this grazing site, we just parked the truck and trailer in one section of the area, and they just went and laid down in the shade that was created by the vehicle and the trailer. And we didn't have any issues with photosensitivity after that. But that is one crop that you can just keep an eye on your livestock, and I'm actually not sure. I think it mostly is more of the sheep that have a problem more than cattle, just the white skin on the sheep or their pink noses and pink skin around their eyes. I would have to look and see if it did have a similar effect on cattle, though.
Okay, we're getting a couple questions in about timing. Here's one. Do you graze the growing wheat the initial fall after planting? And if so, why or why not?
Yeah, so Perry here, we don't. So we have a pretty, I think you could though, because we've played around with that idea of fall grazing of winter wheat, and it didn't, certainly didn't seem to hurt the winter wheat in our environment. But we have a pretty tight fall window here for getting our wheat planted and established, prior to winter. And so there really isn't, it's not like maybe the Central Plains where there can be a lot of biomass, or other parts of the world where there can be a lot of biomass present during that seedling stage that would be grazable. So I think that would be the main reason we probably wouldn't do it. It's just there just probably isn't typically enough biomass there to make it worthwhile. But if we, if there was a weed problem of some sort that we thought we could help with, we might well do that. We haven't had to do that in that exact situation yet. A few times we have ended up grazing in the spring, right? So if we see more weeds competing with the wheat than we're comfortable with in the spring, in this and other studies, we've grazed off that winter wheat in the spring and have been, I guess, impressed at how much yield we get from that regrowth.
Okay. We also have a couple questions about goats. What about considering using goats, as they will utilize some of the weeds the sheep will not, or use a combination of sheep and goats?
Yeah, goats are great as well. We actually did, a few years ago now, we were grazing up in Big Sandy, Montana, a huge wheat production area, and we had some cover crops up there, and we had some plots with goats and some plots with sheep, and the goats did just as good of a job as the sheep, and sometimes even better. A lot of times goats will eat some of the weeds that are more unpalatable for sheep, and goats are more of browsers. Sheep will eat all the really good stuff first, and if you leave them on the plot long enough, they probably will eat most of the weeds there. Fabian mentioned they don't really like the mallow, and we had an issue with them eating the pigweed. If you could use a combination of sheep and goats, they'd probably do an even better job of clearing out all those weeds that we don't want to see.
Okay, here's a question about from someone who's interested in knowing if there are any food safety implications for using grazing animals in vegetable production fields. We know there's been a new, the Food Safety Modernization Act, and so are there any implications for these practices?
Yeah, that's a great, this is Fabian, this is a great question, and I'm not really sure about the answer, I have to admit, because I've been hearing answers in both directions. I guess at this point, and I will strongly recommend to talk with your local organic certification agency, and they will tell you the specifics there, because it was quite related to the how many days you can do it before harvesting, which type of specific crops you will be doing. But in our case, we were in the really safe area, because we were not grazing the crop year, but we were grazing the previous year, the cover crop phase. So for us was safe. Now bringing the animals into the crop year, that when the things may get a little bit more muddy, and I will strongly recommend to talk with the person who's giving you the certification.
And according to the organic regulations, this is Devon here, you do have to wait. If we were grazing something that was going to go into the food production system, you would have to wait 90 days before harvesting that for consumption. So there is a 90-day lag between the grazing and harvest for food production.
Okay, here's a question about sweet clover. Were you able to terminate sweet clover so as to maximize soil water retention in June, or how long does it take to achieve termination?
So I think that, that's a key question. You know, Devon mentioned how we were learning things throughout the study. When we first started, we thought we had to get rid of that sweet clover. I assumed that as long as there was a remaining green plant with new buds coming from the crown, that we would have a weed in essence, a weed competition problem with our subsequent winter wheat that would be very problematic. And so we hammered it very hard that first year that we grew the sweet clover, and in the end, I remember being very frustrated that we could not get the sheep to remove it and stop it from trying to grow. We planted the winter wheat anyways, and there were I'd say at least half the sweet clover plants were still throwing new buds from the base, and I was like, oh my, this is going to be terrible for crop competition next year. And I called around. I actually have some training in forages, so I called around some of my colleagues to ask, just how obligate is this biennial habit for sweet clover? Because we weren't sure. Maybe it would just be a short-lived perennial and it would survive. Very thankfully, the next spring, there was not one live sweet clover plant in there. And so that taught us a pretty important lesson, that really all we had to do was control the seed formation. So as long as we could graze the blossoms and graze the leaves off enough, that gave us quite a bit of license to leave standing stems and the additional stems and material that they trample onto the soil surface, and not really worry about it being a potential overwintering weed problem in any way.
Okay, how do you address perennial weeds like bindweed and Canada thistle in your system?
Well, that's the $1 million question. So I wish I have an answer. I think we've been conducting a meta-analysis, which is basically when we do a systematic literature review on how to control those two weed species in organic systems. And that was I want to mention, that was an idea that came from organic growers here in the state of Montana. Say, well, why didn't you do that? And we did it, and we are finishing the results as we speak. And basically, there is not a magical solutions we were able to find. I can't give you from the top of my head the exact number of studies we checked, but we started with couple of thousand studies for each one of the two species, and then when we systematically look at the studies in terms if they were correctly designed, if they have a control, what type of, if they were really assessing the control in comparison with the non-treated areas, etc. There's a lot of things we need to consider. We end having around 80 or so studies per each one of these two species. And the conclusions there is that it's not a magic solutions that we can provide, except that the more practices you integrate, the better you are. I think for us, in our case, we are not seeing a tremendous increase of kind of thistle in our studies. That's our, you can see it in the alleyways, but they have not been going into the field that bad. Hopefully they won't go in the next couple of years, and that's perhaps, as Perry said, we were working with crops which were deeply rooted, so highly competitive, plus this crop rotation and the sort of extra whammy that we have when we were grazing those plants. Now, we tried once just grazing a patch of field bindweed, and does not work. So in summary, first of all, wait a couple of weeks or months till we finish this meta-analysis, but second, don't just come with one technique. Grazing is not going to be the silver bullet, but can be one of the many tools you can be using to control perennial weed species. A basic killer in the organic production system in our areas, definitely.
I just wanted to add a little bit to what Fabian was saying. I haven't got much experience with bindweed, but thistle this valley is just an absolute ideal climate and habitat for creeping or Canada thistle development. I've had a long-term rotation study at another research farm, and we had thistle become a real problem in 2 rotations. One, we had a set of organic rotations within otherwise conventional no-till rotations, and certainly the thistle became problematic enough that we had to step away from organic production in almost half of those plots, just because they had become somewhat overrun by thistle. We know that tillage fragments the roots and causes spread of thistle in particular. Same with bindweed, and so tillage is not a solution. Usually it's actually a promoter of spreading these weeds. But interestingly, the other rotation where we had the greatest thistle expression was in our no-till continuous wheat plots. And that, you think about that for a second, continuous wheat, when you start growing wheat after wheat after wheat for years, you build up quite a set of, I think, root pruning pathogens within that system, where it doesn't outright kill the wheat each year, but it actually weakens that plant, certainly weakens the root system. We could measure additional water being left behind at depth, additional nitrate being left behind at depth. So we knew the root system was compromised in those continuous wheat systems, and lo and behold, where does the thistle show up? It shows up in the plots where the resource is not being utilized fully at depth in the soil. So I think you really have to, as Fabian says, it's an integrated approach, but you really have to think about rooting depth when you're competing with thistle.
Okay, let's see, we have a couple comments. One of them is that we had good luck in organic vegetable rotations in the Chicago area using pastured hogs to control both thistle and bindweed. And then we have another comment, which I think is probably in response to the question about whether or not there are any plants that sheep shouldn't be eating. And the comment says Suzanne grass has prussic acid at certain stages. So let's see, moving on to some more questions here. Do you have any ideas about whether there are more appropriate legume species to replace sweet clover that would avoid the problems of the stalks?
Yeah, I don't consider the stalks a problem. I mean, that is we want to provide some soil cover, and we were able to remove in this environment over 3 tons of biomass and still have over a ton of biomass between standing stems and loose residue on the surface. So that's I like that aspect. In terms of its rooting depth, I like it. Sweet clover is a really good fixer. Unlike a perennial like alfalfa or some of the clovers, it's an obligate biennial, and so when it's served its purpose, it's done. you try, we've been working on organic farms where they have alfalfa as a nitrogen source for, I guess, or a cover crop if you want to look at it that way. And getting rid of that alfalfa is really problematic. I mean, it takes excessive amounts of tillage to get rid of it, and usually even then it's not completely successful. The alfalfa will persist in those fields for years to come. So I actually think sweet clover in our environment is probably as good as it gets. Now, the first year we started the study, we did use winter pea. That worked very well for us, but it's not going to be as strong a nitrogen fixer typically as sweet clover. And there's some additional challenges to trying to, never mind the expense of trying to get winter peas sown and to survive in our environment consistently.
Okay, we have a couple more comments from people who also suggest using multi-species grazing with goats and or hogs to help control Canada thistle. So do you feel that the sheep received enough nutrition in the monoculture pens?
I definitely think they received enough nutrition. I mean, if we're seeing a half a pound a gain a day, these sheep are doing great on this forage. And for weed management, grazing in these plots actually provided a nice break for some of our other pastures where the sheep are grazing for most of the spring and summer. So it was kind of nice to be able to pull the sheep out of those pastures, let them go through the plots, graze weeds or graze the winter wheat, graze sweet clover, and then when we're done with that grazing session, they go back to their pasture. So it was kind of a nice rest period for both the plots, let the weeds do a little growing, put them back in their pasture, let them graze the pasture, let the pasture have a break, and bring them back to the plot. So I think a producer could work out a fairly good rotation using their fields and pastures as well.
Okay. Do you have plans for including polyculture cover crops in this study?
That would be Perry. You want to
Yeah,
answer that?
no, so I can sense we're getting a lot of questions about cover crop cocktails, and so that's, again, I want to refer that at least in conventional systems there is a fair effort underway at Montana State University looking at the grazing potential of cover crop polycultures. Cover crop cocktails is another name for them. We have been doing work just looking at some of the soil effects for monoculture legume versus cover crop cocktails. And to be honest, at the plot scale, we're not seeing a big advantage to using the polycultures. We're not seeing any additional biomass. We're not, there's no additional benefit to the soil. Matter of fact, in some cases, you might be better off with legume only if you're really concerned about nitrogen. So I'd remain very interested in this polyculture question. I don't think we have anything in the immediate future relative to organic systems specifically, but always open, if there's a compelling question, compelling research idea that we should be pursuing, I'm always willing to give it consideration.
And just a reminder that the cover crop we're grazing in the vegetable garden was a polyculture, was a cocktail of 4 species, and I think the overall results were very similar in the vegetable garden where we used this polyculture of cover crops versus the small grain where we just have 1 species. So I didn't see any striking differences in terms of, and we did not measure sheep weight gains in the vegetable gardens, but kind of this will be my educated guess for, maybe not the best thing to say in terms of a scientist, like we have educated guesses, but I don't think there was any major differences in terms of the animal health of the 2 systems we were comparing.
Okay, we're getting a couple questions in about spring wheat. What conditions would indicate that the spring wheat growth could be grazed early the year of harvest? My interest would be to graze whenever possible since I'm primarily a sheep farmer looking to add some small grains into a rotation. And we have another question also about spring wheat, about whether you have any plans to try that or if that's impossible for dry farming in Bozeman.
So I think, anytime you're going to think about grazing wheat, it's important to think about the growth stage of that winter wheat. And the first time we ended up in sort of an emergency situation overrun by weeds where we wanted to give it a try to see what grazing would do, we were already in the jointing stage of spring wheat, actually. And so we really didn't have much of a choice. So we did go ahead and graze, and I was surprised that we still ended up with a harvest of around 20 bushels to the acre. The crop didn't look like much after that, but it was a lot cleaner, and we still, in our environment, still did 20 bushels, which, I thought the number was going to be 0, so I thought that was actually, pretty interesting. So I guess we have played with spring wheat in that regard, but when we made the decision at the Fort Ellis study, we really wanted to do it before jointing, before stem elongation. If you're thinking at all about grazing wheat, I think it's important. You're going to have a much bigger yield impact if you get into that stem elongation stage at all. And so you'd want to be making that decision, pulling the trigger sooner than stem elongation.
Okay. What about moisture? Regrowth of sweet clover is not generally acceptable if we want to grow a dryland cash crop the following year.
Yeah, great question. And so, unfortunately, this Fort Ellis site is not a great location to ask questions about, the lower limits of moisture in a semi-arid region. It's in a, we're on that site because it's, a former military base that was donated to MSU, and it's pretty handy, and there's livestock there, and so there's some operational logistics that make it pretty possible. We get pretty good rainfall at that site, probably close to 18 inches on an annual basis. Not all rain, some of that would be snow. So yeah, in a dryland setting, it becomes more of an interesting question, and we have worked with another organic farmer thinking about the portfolio of different legumes that you would have. Annual legumes that are the shallowest rooting and use the least water, to all the way to things like sweet clover and especially alfalfa that can really dry that soil out to a substantial depth. And I think probably portfolio is the right word to use there. You probably want to have, if you're really concerned about saving water, you probably want to have some different options available to you that are going to use a different range of soil water use, so that you're not putting yourself in a real depleted soil moisture state consistently. That's the best answer I can give. I understand where the question comes from. That's the best answer I can give.
Okay. Did you provide any extra feed, like grain or grains mixed, to the sheep, or was their nutrition based only on grazing?
I want to say that Devon's been doing some interesting work on grazing wheat stubble as part of this study too, that helps us bridge or extend that period to get us out to a full 36 months of no grazing. I wonder, Devon, could you say something about that?
Okay, well, in the cover crop grazing, they just have the forage available in the plot for grazing, but as Perry just mentioned, we have done what we've called our feedlot on fields project. So after harvest in early fall, we've actually been finishing lambs out on our wheat stubble plots and providing them with supplemental feed. We actually brought in made little portable feeders for these sheep and put weaned lambs on the fields and offered them either a forage-based pellet or a barley-based pellet, and we wanted to look at the differences in finishing lambs in confinement on the forage-based or grain-based pelleted diet, or finishing them in our wheat stubble fields with the two pellet differences. And that has been a really cool study, and I don't have a lot of results for that, but we are looking at the soil microbial differences. And that'll be really interesting. And actually, some of just the preliminary data that I do have, the sheep actually did finish better out on the wheat stubble fields than they did in confinement. And just an observation, when they're out on the wheat stubble fields and not locked up in smaller pens, they really did just seem happier. They were running around, and we had some days with negative 20-degree weather out there, and the sheep did great out on that wheat stubble, just with their pellet feeders, and we did move the pellet feeders around the plot so as not to have the sheep concentrated in one area. But it's a pretty cool study, and hopefully we'll have some more results from that soon.
That'd be great to have you guys back when you know more. Let's see, do you have any other thoughts on rotational grazing for sheep?
I guess the one thing I think that could be utilized for producers, we've kind of experimented with our sheep in a lot of different ways and tried to have them graze prior to seeding, after seeding, using them for weed management. I think it's definitely cool. This fall we seeded the winter wheat. I mean, just like Perry mentioned, we kind of have a tight window before the snow falls. We have about 6 inches of snow on the ground as of last night, and we have a tight little schedule to get sheep out there and graze, but it is cool that we can seed our winter wheat and then just immediately after put sheep on the plots and let them graze the weeds. So there are ways to rotate them through the plots, have them graze crop residues, have them graze weeds, have them graze the sweet clover cover crop. I think there's a lot of different rotations that we can experiment and find out what ways work best for grazing.
Okay, we have someone who's interested in whether you have any thoughts about fish poop as an organic fertilizer to augment yield. Have you tried that? And whether it's permitted in organic in Montana, I think.
Yeah, I guess that question would be me, and no, we really haven't looked at that. In concert with Clayne Jones, who's our soil fertility extension specialist here at Montana State, we've done some work with blood meal and bone meal actually too, as fertilizer amendments or nutrient amendments in organic systems. I can say typically phosphorus is the limiting nutrient, and so if in our situation, at least over time, and so if it can do something to significantly improve phosphorus supply, that would be something that would be of interest, I suppose.
Okay. Have you found a difference in wheat yields for grazed versus ungrazed wheat?
Yeah. So we didn't formally we didn't formally do that test. We didn't set aside part of the plot and do ungrazed and part of the plot grazed. We did have a graduate student project aimed at that a few years ago, and we got a pretty remarkable difference. But it turned out there was an insect involved there that was causing something. I think the grazing spared the wheat from this particular insect or something like that. So the effect was it was hard to make any conclusions. So no, we really haven't asked that specific question.
Okay. Are honeybees in the future of your experiments with cover crop economics?
We haven't been working on that directly with honeybees, but for example, in one study we did in the Big Sandy area, we were comparing pollinators as well as the bumblebees colonies, and in this case was between organic and conventional fields. So it's not exactly this situation where we have grazed versus tilled system. There were not major differences in terms of the pollinators communities across systems. However, what was interesting is that the growth rate of the bumblebee colonies, as well as the fitness of those bees in terms of the body weight and the fat that they have, was larger in organic fields than conventional fields. We also noticed that the wings were less broken, means that they are flying less. That's perhaps why they are growing more and more in organic fields, and the reason is very simple. In the organic fields we have more dicot weeds. Perry was mentioning the issue of terminating alfalfa as a cover crop. I would say the positive aspect of not doing a good termination for an alfalfa field is that they provide a lot of resources for those bumblebees. So, overall, we did not compare, because we could not compare pollinators in these plots areas because they are too small, so we were forced to do very large-scale studies where we have thousands of acres of organic or conventional fields. We work with very large fields so we can see if there's any tendency across systems, and we didn't see difference in the pollinators community or abundance, but we saw a larger fitness of the colonies of the pollinators.
So I wanted to add to that. I'm involved in some work with David Weaver, who's a renowned entomologist here at MSU, working in wheat stem sawfly, and that might not be an insect pest that's familiar to people outside of Montana, but it's certainly very familiar to growers inside of Montana. And David we've got a graduate student involved, and we've got some preliminary observations on the benefits of having a cover crop adjacent to a wheat field for providing nectar supply to the parasitic wasp that attacks the wheat stem sawfly. And that looks, we're not sure the extent of that value, but there definitely is some value to that. And so that's a question that I know some farmers are certainly interested in if they're battling wheat stem sawfly.
But I'd like to thank everyone who submitted questions. Thank you so much, Fabian, Perry, and Devon, for sharing your work with us, and thanks to everyone for joining us today.